Sweet soul, take a breath right now. Feel that? That is your angels wrapping their loving arms around you in this very moment. You are seen. You are held. You are deeply, completely loved. Welcome to the Angel's Message for You original channel. This is our only official channel. Please beware of copycat and pirated channels, and stay connected to the original source for authentic angel messages and true blessings. A special thank you to our soul subscribers Laverne and Chung Kwai for their generous support through Ko-Fi link. Super thanks. Your contributions mean the world to us, sending you countless angel blessings. Now, I need you to stay with me until the very end of this message, because what the angels are revealing to you today is something that is already happening in the unseen world around you. Something that involves your heart, your love, and a connection that never truly went away. Do not scroll past this. What you are about to hear could change everything. Right now, without you even knowing it, a farewell is happening. And it is happening because of you. Someone who loves you has been holding on to this feeling for a very long time. They tried everything to move forward. They filled their days with distractions, kept themselves busy, told themselves they were doing fine. But no matter what they tried, the feeling for you never left. Not even a little. Even without seeing you, even without knowing how things would turn out, something deep inside this person kept pulling them back to what the two of you share. That love stayed alive, quietly growing in the silence. And now it no longer fits inside their chest. So this person is walking away from everything that has been standing between this love and the life it was always meant to live. Your soulmate is saying goodbye, but not to you, never to you. They are saying goodbye to everything that kept this love hidden, everything that held it back, everything that no longer belongs to this new chapter they are stepping into. And the reason for all of it is you. Beloved soul, your person's heart is now full of certainty. The questioning is over. The doubting is done. What they feel for you has not faded. It never faded. It only grew stronger with every single day. And whether they fully realized it or not, you were the one keeping that love alive inside them. You are the reason for this transformation that is now changing everything. For a long time, your person wondered if you still felt anything. They looked for signs. They waited. But eventually they stopped looking outward and listened inward. And when they got still and truly listened, what they heard was your name. Every single day, over and over again. That is why this farewell is not an ending. It is a beginning that is only possible because you exist. This is not about impulse. This is not about loneliness or neediness. This is about truth. The quiet, unshakable, soul-deep kind of truth that does not need anyone's permission to exist. Your person decided to let go of everything that delayed this love from blossoming. Old habits, old fears, old paths that led nowhere real. All of it is being released to make room for what has always been meant to be. And what caused all of this? You. Simply by being you. You are the reason for this beautiful and courageous decision. You are the cause of this farewell that carries no sadness, only hope. Because your person believes that on the other side of this new beginning, you will be there with an open heart. And they are walking toward you with everything they have. Dearest one, your person went through so many confusing seasons. Life pulled them in so many different directions. And yet through all of it, the feeling for you stayed steady like a flame that would not go out no matter how hard the wind blew. After trying so hard to fit into a version of life that did not include you, they finally had to admit the truth. It is simply not possible to keep living in a world where you are absent. Something essential is always missing. That is why they are letting go. Not of you, of everything that has been delaying your story from being told. What this person carries now is no longer doubt. It is urgency. It is conviction. It is the deep knowing that they cannot keep pretending this love does not matter. Getting to this place was not easy. There were days of holding back tears, of talking themselves out of reaching out, of trying hard to convince their heart to accept something that was never truly natural for them. But you kept showing up, in thoughts, in memories that arrived without warning, in dreams that returned just when everything seemed settled. And each time you appeared, something in this person woke back up. Even when everything seemed finished, the love stayed strong, as if the soul already knew there was still something left to be lived between you. Your person thought long and carefully before making this decision. Every action they are now taking comes from a truth that has been growing slowly, like roots pushing through stone. They tried to walk other paths, but nothing could erase what you represent to them. While other things in their life lost their shine, your name kept glowing from the inside, not as a fading memory, as a love that does not age, does not cool, does not dim. That is why everything is changing now. This is not about weakness. This is about finally understanding that life only truly makes sense when this love is lived fully and openly. Your person is releasing old habits, old fears, old roads that kept them far from what really matters. It is no longer possible for them to pretend you are not at the center of their heart. And even if no one has said these words out loud to you before, the angels are confirming it now. This transformation is happening because of you. All of it. Every bit of it. You have always been the reason for so many quiet smiles in this person's life, even without knowing it. They held on to the hope that one day, you both could build something real and beautiful together. But time has a way of turning quiet longing into urgent truth. This person is no longer waiting for life to arrange itself perfectly. They are choosing. They are acting. They are taking real steps so this love can finally be free from everything that used to hold it back. Every single step being taken right now is moving toward you. Even if you cannot see it yet, something powerful is shifting on the other side. Your person is changing their life, saying goodbye to everything that does not carry your name, stepping away from an old way of living because they finally understood none of it made sense anymore. Because it is with you that days gain their color. Because it is thinking of you that their heart finds peace. This person has been preparing emotionally for a long, long time. It was in the hardest, quietest nights when everything felt hopeless that this love showed its full strength. And it was because of you that this soul chose to keep moving forward. But now it is no longer possible to carry this feeling only in thought. The farewell is happening to clear the path for what is true to finally have the chance it deserves. You may have tried to distract yourself. You may have told yourself the chapter was closed. But what this person feels for you has never dimmed. It became the foundation for a complete and total change. And that change has already begun. In the coming days, you will start to notice things. Small signs, quiet signals, things that remind you that love is closer than it seems, that this connection between you is still alive and breathing, that this farewell was never an end. It was the preparation for a true and real encounter. Everything being done is being done in faith. Every thought, every action, every step this person takes now carries the quiet hope of one day being close to you again, of looking into your eyes, of letting you feel everything that until now has only ever been imagined. And there is nothing more beautiful than watching someone let go of every single thing that holds them back, just to come closer to the one they truly love. This person wants to live with you what for so long has only been a dream. And this desire is so real, so strong, that it is now becoming action. That is why you may be feeling a shift in your energy lately. That is why your heart feels a little more open, a little more tender, a little more awake. Because this love is coming, and it is coming with truth. You are the reason for all of it. You are at the center of this beautiful decision. Beloved soul, for a long time, your person tried to move forward as if feelings could simply be packed away and stored somewhere safe out of reach. They kept themselves busy, tried new things, surrounded themselves with distractions, told themselves your absence was something they could eventually get used to. But the heart always found its way back to the same place. Always back to you. No distraction was ever enough. No new path ever erased the desire to be close to you. As time passed, trying to ignore the feeling only made everything clearer. Every time their heart jumped for no obvious reason. Every time your face appeared in their mind without any invitation. They felt something that nothing else in the world could recreate. It was different. It was unmistakable. It was love asking to be heard. Life pushed them in other directions. But none of those directions ever felt whole. No choice felt completely right when their thoughts still reached for you. Being away from you taught them what truly being present with someone meant. And the more time went by, the stronger the feeling grew that the distance between you was never natural, never right. Their love could not live permanently in the past. That truth eventually became bigger than any fear, bigger than any doubt, bigger than any amount of waiting. The soul asked for courage, for honesty, for surrender. That is when they looked inside themselves and understood that living apart from you was like living at half strength. Their heart had already made its choice a long time ago. What remained was simply to honor it. To stop keeping this love small as if it were something to be embarrassed about. They no longer want to walk through life wondering what might have been. They no longer want to lie awake holding back what they feel. And more than anything, they no longer want to carry the weight of never having tried. Your person already knows what they want. They do not want to live separated from you. They do not want to keep nurturing a love that only exists in memory. They do not want your story to live only in private thoughts with no one else to witness it. Everything they feel for you comes from something real and sacred, from the certainty that something genuine and rare exists between you two, that what you shared, even briefly, even imperfectly, left marks in them that no one else has been able to erase. And when the heart reaches that kind of knowing, there is nothing left to debate. Only movement, only a step forward that finally shows what words have not been able to say. The farewell that is happening right now is not heavy. It is freeing. Your person is releasing the fear of being too much, the worry of not being welcomed back, the doubt of whether there is still room for this love. All of that is being set aside because something stronger is guiding every step now. The certainty that you are the reason their heart still beats with real meaning. They no longer need the world to confirm what they want. Their heart has already answered. That answer returns every single day in thoughts that circle back to you, in feelings that simply will not fade. That is why your person is changing everything. Letting go of old stories that no longer serve them, old ways of thinking, old versions of themselves, because what matters now is living with truth. And that truth is you. What is coming does not spring from a passing impulse. It comes from a love that grew slowly and quietly over time. A love that survived everything, even the moments when it seemed like there was absolutely no way forward. And now, after feeling all of that so deeply, this person has decided to truly live, to stop pretending, to follow the path that their heart has always asked for. and that path leads straight to you. Your person is no longer looking for distractions. They are looking for you, stepping away from places that do not move them anymore, walking away from situations that do not touch their soul, because they understood that anything that is not you no longer completes them, no longer holds them together, no longer makes sense. What keeps them going is the desire to find you. And this desire has grown so big that it is impossible to keep acting like nothing is happening. No matter how fast the world spins around them, your person has chosen to pause, to get still, and to finally listen to what their heart has been saying all along. And when they listened deeply, they understood. It is time to let this love move from thought into real presence. Time to stop pretending that life away from you feels as real as it should. That is when the farewell made complete sense. Because it is not running away from something. It is running toward something. Toward you. Toward what truly fulfills. Toward what has always been true. This farewell is the beginning of something new. A new season. A new chance. Not built on empty promises but on real feeling. On a love that has remained alive through absolutely everything. You may not have noticed yet, but something inside you has already started responding to this shift. Do you feel it? That slightly different energy? Thoughts that keep returning to someone? Emotions surfacing from somewhere you cannot quite name? This is not coincidence. This is the reflection of a connection that was never truly broken. This is your person's love reaching you even before their physical presence arrives. They no longer want to simply imagine what being close to you would feel like. They want to live it. They want to show you through real actions what has been kept in silence for so long. They are willing to give up everything that has kept them away. Every barrier, every excuse, every story that once seemed bigger than love, just for the chance to stand before you and let you feel the full force of what they carry for you. What is about to happen is bigger than any fear, because a firm and grounded decision is behind everything now. Your person has understood that they cannot keep building a life where you are absent from it. They cannot keep filling the heart with anything less than what they feel when they think of you. They are saying goodbye to what was never complete, to finally live what has always been true. And all of this is because of you. Because you are the one who awakened this change. Because your love is powerful enough to transform a life. Because in the end, you are the destination this person has chosen with their whole heart. Dearest soul, you might not fully realize it yet, but your presence has a real and powerful impact on someone who loves you. It does not matter how much time has passed or how many attempts were made to move on. Nothing has erased what you awaken in this person. What you bring to your soulmate is unlike anything else. Something no one else has ever been able to recreate in them. When this person thinks of you, something shifts inside. Their whole way of seeing the world changes. Plans gain more meaning. Even difficult days become a little more bearable because the hope of true love stays alive. You were never just another person in their life. You have always been that name their heart quietly repeats to itself. That thought that comes back at the most unexpected moments. That desire that simply refused to leave. Even on the days when they tried to convince themselves they had moved on, your name stayed present. In memories that arrived without being invited. In songs that hit differently. In small, everyday moments that seemed to whisper that you were still part of something far greater than either of you could see. Their love felt all of this and finally understood it could no longer be denied. What you represent to this person cannot be compared to anyone or anything else. You have a place in their heart that no one else has ever filled. And this truth only grew stronger over time. With every returning memory, with every dream that brought you back, With every unexpected feeling that sparked without explanation, your soulmate understood more clearly that what they feel for you is not ordinary. It is rare. It is deep. It is real. And for that reason, it can no longer be treated as something small or temporary. What you awaken in this person is a new and genuine desire to truly live. Wait, before we continue with today's angel message, your angels are asking me to pause for just a moment. This part of the message was not meant for everyone. In fact, only a small number of people listening right now will truly understand why these words are appearing at this exact moment. If you felt guided to watch this video, if you've stayed here until now, if something deep inside you told you not to scroll away, then this may not be a coincidence. Your angels want you to pay close attention, because they keep showing me someone who has been carrying a heavy burden in their heart. Someone who has spent nights wondering why love feels so difficult. Someone who has given their heart, their time, their energy, only to feel unseen, unappreciated, or emotionally disconnected. Perhaps you've been asking God for a sign that love can still find you, a sign that the relationship you're hoping for can become deeper, stronger, and more meaningful. Or maybe you've been praying for someone special to finally recognize your worth. If that resonates, your angels want you to know something. Sometimes the answer to our prayers doesn't arrive as a miracle falling from the sky. Sometimes it arrives as a tool, a message, or a resource placed directly in our path at exactly the right moment. And today, I feel guided to share something called Make Him Worship You. This isn't about manipulation. It's not about controlling anyone. Instead, it's a relationship guidance program designed to help women understand the emotional triggers, feminine energy, and connection patterns that inspire deeper devotion, attraction, and commitment from the man they care about. Your angels keep showing me the word magnetism. Not chasing, not forcing. Magnetism, the kind of energy that naturally draws love closer. Imagine waking up feeling valued. Imagine no longer questioning where you stand. Imagine a relationship where affection flows more naturally, where communication feels easier, and where the person you care about begins to see you in a completely different light. Picture yourself feeling confident, desired, and emotionally secure. What if the breakthrough you've been praying for isn't about changing him? What if it's about discovering something within yourself that unlocks a completely new dynamic between you? Sometimes divine timing places information in front of us before we're fully aware of why we need it. And for someone listening right now, I strongly feel this message was meant to find you. If your heart is telling you not to ignore this sign, if something within you feels curious, if you've been asking the universe, your angels, or God for guidance in your love life, then you may want to explore Make Him Worship You. The link is available in the video description and pinned comment. Don't overthink it. Simply follow what resonates, because opportunities often appear quietly before they transform our lives. And sometimes the next chapter begins with one small step of faith. Now take a deep breath. Thank your angels for the guidance you've received today. And let's return to the message they originally wanted you to hear. Take what resonates, leave the rest, and allow divine timing to continue unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Even without realizing it, you have been the reason for so many moments of quiet courage in their life. This person has gotten up from difficult days with your name somewhere in their thoughts. They have found hope where there seemed to be none. They believed in love again because what they feel for you never lost its shine. And even when everything around them was pushing toward forgetting, their heart kept insisting on keeping you alive inside. Your soulmate tried other things, other paths, other stories, but everything always felt empty compared to the depth of what you two share. And even with time and distance between you, the feeling did not change. What you awakened stayed. It grew stronger, and now it is asking to be lived with truth, with surrender, with real and lasting action. What you bring out in this person moves them from the very inside. It is not a comparison to anything else. It is a certainty. When they think of you, the world goes quiet for just a moment. Everything that seemed heavy becomes a little lighter. You have become a place of peace inside the life of someone who had been searching for exactly that feeling for a very long time. No matter what the outside world says about logic or timing or whether any of this makes practical sense, what exists between you goes beyond all of that. Your person understood this slowly, quietly, without any big announcement. And now what was once held back out of fear has become courage, has become action, because it is simply no longer possible to hold back something this real. It is time to make it real. You awaken a deep desire to care, to build, to stay. Even without knowing it, you have been the reason for quiet joy on days that should have felt gray. And that is why this person is willing to release everything that delays them, everything that confuses them, everything that has kept them from what really matters. Because the love they carry for you is greater than all of those things combined. This love is now asking to be honored, to be lived with maturity and with wholeness. This person is coming toward you not from need but from choice. Because what they feel for you did not arrive by accident. It was built slowly, honestly, with real feeling. What you awaken can no longer be set aside. Time will not keep waiting, and neither will the heart. This decision to move toward you is the most beautiful proof that this love is strong enough to overcome everything that once tried to stand in its way. You have been the quiet, steady force behind so much of this person's life. A memory they returned to, a refuge they carried inside, a desire that stayed, a hope that refused to die. And now you are about to become a real and living presence. What was once only a dream is beginning to take shape. And the reason for that is the truth that you sparked in another heart, simply by being who you are. This is not about putting you on a pedestal. It is about recognizing that you are genuinely irreplaceable, that what you create in this person cannot be found anywhere else. Your soulmate is releasing everything that does not carry the same weight, the same depth, the same soul-level vibration. Because alongside every other story they have ever known, what they feel for you has always stood apart, always been greater, always had deeper roots. And now it is ready to bloom the way it always deserved to, with honesty, with care, with full and open surrender. The feeling you sparked was never surface level. It touched places no one else had ever reached. It brought forgotten dreams back to life. It woke up the desire to build something truly worth having. And for that reason, this love will not be wasted. It is being honored, embraced, lived. You are the reason for a transformation. And when this person comes closer, you will see it in their eyes. You will understand that it was never just a memory. It was a choice that had your name written all the way through it, even in the moments when you did not know it. Dearest one, the farewell happening right now does not come from hurt. It does not come from wanting to escape. It comes from the courage of someone who is simply tired of loving in silence. This is the kind of decision that only someone who truly, deeply loves can make. Your person is not leaving you. They are leaving behind everything that kept this love from breathing freely. The time has arrived when this person can no longer look past what they feel. Every memory that kept surfacing, every thought that would not quiet down, every emotion held silently inside, all of it has been revealing something far too important to keep ignoring. There is simply no way forward that does not include you. And this farewell is happening precisely because your person wants to live this love fully, without barriers, without fear, without any more delay. There is no anger in what is being let go. There is gratitude for everything that led to this moment. But now the focus has moved to something deeper and truer. Everything that no longer resonates, everything that no longer nourishes the heart, is being released gently and with peace. Because true love needs room. And you are the reason this person is finally creating that room. You are the one who woke up this desire to begin again in the most honest way possible. This farewell is beautiful because it does not come from the absence of feeling. It exists precisely because feeling is stronger than it has ever been. The longing grew. The desire to live this love fully grew alongside it. And the thought of delaying it any further became more painful than the thought of taking the risk. Your person realized they no longer just want to imagine closeness. They want to allow themselves to actually have it. And to do that, they had to release what was no longer making space for love. For a long time, they tried other roads, tried to talk themselves into other truths, kept the mind busy with anything that might quiet the heart. But nothing could fill that space. No other place brought the kind of deep, inner peace that even just the memory of your love offered. And that is when the farewell began to truly take shape. When the heart understood it could no longer fit in a life that did not include you. This person's life is now being quietly reorganized around one clear certainty. You are part of everything that still makes sense to them. You are at the center of their most sincere feelings, in the plans that have come back to life, in the intentions that are now clearer than they have ever been. All of this is being done out of love. This farewell is an act of love. Not because anyone forced it, because it was felt so completely that nothing else was possible. Your person is not trying to prove anything to the world. They just want to be faithful to what they feel inside. They want to live this feeling honestly, without having to pretend their heart is calm when everything inside is reaching for you. Your soulmate is putting an end to what was preventing this truth from being lived. And that is only possible because you exist. Because your presence, even from a distance, was always enough to keep this love burning. There was fear. Of course there was. There were doubts like any human being carries. But the feeling was stronger than both. And that is why this farewell does not feel like an ending. Feels like freedom, like the first real breath after a long time of holding it in, like clarity arriving after a long fog, because when the heart truly decides, nothing in the world can hold it back. Before this message goes deeper into your heart, pause and check the channel name carefully. Some people are stealing and reposting our content, but copied messages do not carry the same positive spiritual energy. Stay connected to the original source, Angel's Message for You channel with the black logo base. And now, let your angels speak to you. You are the one who awakened this courage. Not because you asked for it, because it was felt. Because your very existence has been quietly pushing this person closer to their own truth all along. And now everything that was once postponed is becoming possible. There is no more room to hold back a love this real. Everything being released is simply the natural result of choosing to live what truly matters. This farewell is not easy. It takes real strength, real faith, but what sustains it is you. Your person is not leaving with pain. They are freeing themselves to love with more honesty than they ever have before. They are releasing what no longer made their heart feel alive. And they are doing it on purpose, with clear intention, with the deep desire to be fully and completely present with you. There is no regret in letting go of what no longer serves. There is only peace. because what is coming has real and lasting value. And that value has your name written all the way through it. You are the reason for this change. You are the reason this person is letting go of what no longer adds anything real to their life. Not because they had to, because they chose to, because they feel it, because they believe in what you share. This decision is beautiful because it was born entirely from love, from the longing to build something clean, light, and true by your side. What for so long was only a quiet dream is now taking its first real steps toward becoming real. And as everything begins to fall into place, the weight of this farewell lifts. It becomes the first step toward you, taken with firmness, with surrender, with the complete certainty that this is exactly what the heart has always wanted. You may not realize right now how deeply you matter, but it is your image that motivates. It is the memory of your presence that brings comfort. It is the desire to see you that gives meaning to every action being taken. Your person is releasing everything for love, not from weakness, because they finally understood that nothing, absolutely nothing, is worth more than living truthfully. They want you to feel this, to sense the strength of what is moving toward you, to understand that this farewell is not about getting your attention. It is a necessary and honest step toward coming to you the right way, because loving you in silence is no longer enough. Now is the time for presence, for meeting, for words spoken with a completely open heart. The love for you is not being left behind. It is being claimed. This farewell is for everything that needs to end so that this love can flourish the way it was always meant to. And when your person comes closer, you will feel the difference. You will see that nothing is being done on impulse. Everything is being done for you, for the peace of having you near, for the joy of loving without walls between you. Not everyone has the courage to let go of what feels familiar and walk toward what they truly desire. It is one of the hardest things a person can do, to look at a life they built, even an imperfect and incomplete one, and say, "This is not enough." To walk away not out of anger, not out of drama, but out of love, out of the quiet, unshakable knowing that the heart deserves more than pretending. Your person did exactly that, and the courage that carried them forward has your name at its root. It was your name that gave them strength on the days when fear was loudest. It was the thought of you that reignited the desire to try even when every logical part of them said it was too late. This courage did not arrive all at once. It was built slowly, in the silence of many late nights, in the weight of feelings that never quite found their way to words, in the small and private moments where something inside simply refused to stop believing. Every time your person thought of you, a forgotten part of them woke up again. The heart remembered, effortlessly and without effort, why everything began. And the stronger that remembering became, the more obvious it was that you were always the right direction. Not one of several options, the only real direction. You were not just a memory they were holding on to. You became the reason to change. The quiet push they needed to step away from a life where something important was always missing. Your person tried, many times, to silence what their heart kept saying, to create distance, to convince themselves that what they felt was just nostalgia, just habit, just the mind playing tricks. But the more they tried to walk away from it, the closer you became in the interior world they carried with them everywhere. In memory, in feeling, in the deep inner knowing that would not be reasoned with. And it became impossible to keep living as though that knowing was not there. Because the love for you has always been larger than any distraction, any story, any substitute the world could offer. Nothing could replace what you awaken. Nothing came close. The courage stepping forward now did not come from a single moment of inspiration. It came from accumulated love. From the nights when sleep stayed far away and thoughts drifted back to you through old memories. From the afternoons when the heart ached without any obvious cause, and simply letting your name move through the mind brought something like relief. It was in those quiet, private moments that your person understood they could no longer fight against their own heart, that the time had come to accept what was already so clear. You are still everything this person wants, not as an idea, as a reality, as the one person who has always made everything feel more real, more alive, more worth waking up for. Nothing was harder for them than admitting that what they had been living was only a shadow of what they truly longed for. But the love for you was always the light pointing the way through the dark. And when this person finally chose to face their own truth honestly, you were present in every part of it. In every plan that resurfaced. In every dream that came back. In every desire they had been quietly carrying and not letting anyone see. It was thinking of you that helped them reconnect with who they truly are at their deepest level. And for that reason, every action now being taken carries your name as its truest and most primary reason. You were not simply a chapter that ended. You became the turning point, the moment the story changed direction. And even without knowing it, you inspired a courage in this person that they did not know they had. Because what they feel for you has never once been confused with something passing or temporary. It has always been love, the kind that waits, the kind that endures through seasons of silence, the kind that keeps quietly insisting, even in the dark, that it is still worth it. This person is not seeking you because they have run out of other options. They are seeking you because they know, in that place that is deeper than thought and older than logic, that loving you still makes complete sense. That it will always make sense. Even if the path is not perfectly clear. Even if there are things left uncertain. What matters now is what beats. And what beats is you. Your name. The desire to build something pure and lasting with the one who has always held a sacred place in this heart. Every step forward has you as the reference point. Not because you asked for that. Because it was felt. Because your presence never failed to stir something real and different and alive. And that is exactly why this courage exists. Because deep down, this person always knew you were not like anyone else. Always knew the love for you was different. Too real to be forgotten. Too true to be set aside forever. Too strong to be replaced by anything less. This courage grew in absence. It grew on the days when missing you was a physical weight with no name to give it. It grew in the words that were never spoken but were always felt. It grew in the interior silence where the feeling for you never once stopped beating its quiet, faithful beat. And now this courage has found its voice, its path, its direction. And it is walking toward you, not to replay the past. To live a present that is more honest and more surrendered than anything before. While you were navigating your own life, someone was thinking of you with tenderness. While you faced your own seasons of uncertainty and growth, there was a soul out there made stronger by the simple thought of finding you again. Not returning to something old and finished. Choosing something new. Choosing you. But this time with eyes wide open and heart fully ready. And now that future is being built quietly and surely, with you at the very center of it. Beloved soul, now that you have heard all of this, do not ignore what you feel. Listen to what your heart is quietly trying to show you. Allow yourself to notice the signs showing up around you. Allow yourself to receive the love that is already on its way to you. It is not coming to confuse you. It is coming to complete you, to offer what has been missing for too long. And you deserve this. You deserve a love that does not ask you to make yourself smaller, that does not hide from you, that sees you fully and still chooses to stay. Your person is not coming from a place of need. They are coming from a place of love, with truth, with maturity, with the genuine desire to walk beside you with ease and with devotion, coming to add to your life, not to take from it, coming to transform, not to disrupt. Pay attention to the days ahead. Words, actions, quiet signs, everything will begin showing you that this is real. Not as fantasy, but as the living consequence of everything that has been deeply felt and now finally has the space to become real. Love does not need justification when it is true. It only needs two hearts willing to receive it. And right now, one heart has already been beating for you for a very long time. Perhaps now yours is ready to say yes. You are more precious than you know, more needed than you realize, more loved than you may have allowed yourself to fully believe. And that is why all of this is happening now. Because there are feelings that simply cannot wait any longer. Truths that can no longer stay hidden. And reunions that are not accidents. They are part of something greater, something designed by the angels themselves to heal, to transform, and to complete what was always meant to be whole. The farewell has been made. The path ahead is clear. The heart has decided. Prepare yourself, beloved soul, because the love that has always been searching for you is almost here. And always know this. You are never alone. Your angels are with you in every breath, every step, every quiet moment of uncertainty. You are seen. You are held. You are deeply and completely loved. If this message touched your heart today, just whisper to yourself from that soft, tender place inside you, I receive this. I am ready. And know that heaven has already heard you. Dear beautiful soul, this angel's message for you channel is a divine space, a sanctuary for the soul. If you're new to this channel, think of this as your spiritual home. It's a sacred space created intentionally for faith to grow, purpose to be sparked, and God-given destinies to be confirmed and lived out. We are busy building a lively community deeply rooted in the rich soil of God's unconditional love. A place where heaven truly speaks into our lives and deep, lasting change regularly happens. We warmly invite you to subscribe and stay connected, because God undoubtedly has so much more to reveal and bring about in your unique life journey. You genuinely don't want to miss what the divine is preparing to do next in and through you. Consider making a generous contribution if you feel moved to support our efforts of spreading divine messages. Whether it's $5, $10, $20, or $50, your contribution enables us to continue sharing these profound messages of healing and hope with the world. Spreading the word is just the beginning of our mission. Hearts are being healed, hope is being renewed, and souls are being guided back to the light. Your support helps us realize our shared goal of making a positive impact. Your generosity, no matter how small, is what keeps our community thriving and bringing people together in love on this sacred journey. We are all interconnected, and we will rise as one. By uniting, we can conquer this. Let us wholeheartedly embrace the abundance that lies ahead. Amen.